The galaxy was old and it was tired. Entire civilizations had been born, burned bright, and faded into myth long before the current war had begun. Stars had shifted, trade lanes had collapsed and reformed, and species that once believed themselves eternal had quietly gone extinct when the universe proved otherwise. The Coalition had always believed it understood war. It understood fleets and supply lines, understood sacrifice in neat, mathematical terms. It understood when a world could be held and when it must be abandoned. What it had never understood was how to keep going when every calculation said to stop. The war against the Devourer tide had lasted 73 standard cycles, 73 cycles of retreat, containment, and loss mitigation, 73 cycles of commanders standing before holographic star maps watching systems go dark, one by one, while reassuring their people that the line was holding somewhere else. Entire species had been reduced to refugee populations drifting between allied worlds, carrying with them the slow, crushing realization that survival no longer meant victory. It only meant delay. In the high strategic concourse, the air was heavy with recycled oxygen and unspoken dread. Generals and admirals stood in clustered silence around the central projection, their eyes fixed on the spreading crimson mass that represented enemy-controlled space. The tide did not negotiate. It did not posture. It consumed, dismantled, and moved on, leaving behind planets stripped to bedrock and orbital graveyards thick with wreckage. High strategist Kelvar, whose species lived nearly 5 centuries, felt older than he ever had. His frilled crest had dulled in color, a biological sign of prolonged stress. He had overseen wars before, border conflicts, resource skirmishes, ideological crusades, but this was different. This was entropy with intent. "We cannot hold the inner ring," one analyst said quietly. "Not with current force allocation." Kelvar did not respond immediately. He already knew. Everyone in the room knew. The models had been run 1,000 times with different variables, different assumptions, different levels of optimism injected by desperate minds. They all ended the same way: extinction or something close enough to be indistinguishable. "There is one option remaining," said Ambassador Thyrus, her voice cutting through the gloom. She was younger than most in the chamber, her species valuing adaptability over longevity. That adaptability had earned her more than one assignment others considered pointless. Kelvar turned toward her. "We have exhausted conventional options." "This is not a conventional one," Thyrus replied. She activated a secondary projection. The star map shifted, zooming out beyond known coalition space, past regions long abandoned or deemed irrelevant. It stopped on a small, unremarkable yellow star. Most of the room reacted with confusion. A few reacted with faint irritation. "That system is uninhabited," someone said. "Not uninhabited," Thyrus corrected. "Forgot." Kelvar stared at the data tags now blooming around the star, ancient records, fragmented scans, warnings logged so long ago that their authors were dust. "Earth," Kelvar read aloud, his tone skeptical. "A death world classification from pre-expansion myth cycles." A low murmur rippled through the chamber. The myths were old, older than the Coalition itself. Stories told in academic circles as curiosities or in cultural cautionary tales meant to frighten younglings into obedience. A species that evolved under crushing gravity, volatile climate, constant predation, and internal conflict so intense it bordered on self-annihilation. "They were never confirmed," an admiral said. "No verified contact, no transmissions in millennia." "Because no one went looking," Thyrus said. "Everyone assumed they destroyed themselves, or that they were never real to begin with." Kelvar folded his hands behind his back. "And you propose what, Ambassador? That we stake the survival of the galaxy on a ghost story?" "I propose," Thyrus replied steadily, "that we consider the possibility that a species forged by relentless adversity might understand something we do not." Silence followed. Not because the idea was persuasive, but because it was terrifying. The tide did not fear technology. It adapted. It did not fear numbers. It overwhelmed. It did not fear sacrifice because it did not conceptualize loss the way sentient coalitions did. Every strategy the galaxy knew how to employ had failed because every strategy assumed a breaking point. What if the problem was that the galaxy broke too easily? Against protocol, against consensus, and against reason, a mission was approved. A single diplomatic vessel, stripped of identifiable coalition markings, was dispatched toward the yellow star. Its orders were simple: verify the myth. When Thyrus's ship emerged from fold space at the edge of the system, she expected desolation. Radiation scars, orbital debris, the remnants of a civilization that had burned itself out. Instead, she found traffic. Primitive by coalition standards, perhaps, but undeniably active. Satellites ringed the planet in dense layers. Ship signatures flickered across local space, controlled, coordinated, alive. The planet below was blue and green, wrapped in cloud systems that churned with violent beauty. Earth was not dead. Contact protocols were initiated carefully. The response was not immediate, but it was calm, cautious, analytical. No threats, no panic. A request for identification phrased with measured neutrality. Thyrus found herself studying the visual feed when it came through. The beings who appeared on her screen did not match the myths in any obvious way. They were small, soft-skinned, lacking natural armor, claws, or visible weaponry. Their eyes were expressive, their movements economical. They looked fragile. And yet, there was something in the way they held themselves, a stillness, a readiness. Not the tension of fear, but the coiled patience of something that had learned the value of waiting. They listened. Thyrus explained the war, the tide, the losses, the inevitability. She did not embellish. Humans, as they called themselves, did not interrupt. They asked questions, precise ones, about enemy behavior, about logistics, about casualty tolerance, about how long the galaxy had been losing. When she finished, there was a pause. Then a human spoke, not loudly, not dramatically. "You've been fighting this thing by trying not to die," he said. "That's not how you beat predators." Thyrus felt something shift in her chest. "You believe you can defeat it." The human tilted his head slightly. "We believe we can fight it. The rest we'll find out the hard way." It took time, weeks of negotiation, data exchange, cautious trust building, but eventually a decision was reached. Humanity would send a limited expeditionary force. Advisors, analysts, volunteers, not legions, not armadas. Just enough to see the enemy firsthand. When human ships arrived in coalition space, they were met with disappointment. They were not imposing. Their hulls were functional, not elegant. Their weapons were modular, adaptable, not overwhelming. Their soldiers were bipeds with no exoskeletal reinforcement, no energy shielding integrated into their bodies. "They will not survive a standard engagement," one commander muttered. And so, politely and without ceremony, humanity was assigned to a backwater, a minor outpost on the fringe of contested space, a place of little strategic value where they could contribute without risking meaningful assets. The humans accepted the assignment without protest. They arrived, unpacked, and got to work. They did not complain about inadequate facilities or outdated equipment. They modified what they had. They trained constantly, not just in weapons use but in logistics, repair, medical response. They asked endless questions of the local garrison, listened more than they spoke, and quietly began to improve things no one had realized were broken. They mapped enemy patrol patterns others had dismissed as random. They adjusted firing drills to account for fatigue over time, not just peak performance. They encouraged mixed-species squads, pairing veterans with newcomers, ensuring knowledge flowed instead of stagnating. When the tide attacked that outpost, it did so because the models said it would fall quickly. The humans did not evacuate. They dug in. They fought wounded. They fought exhausted. They fought when ammunition ran low and hands shook from strain. They rotated positions so no one collapsed completely, carried the injured back into line when possible, and when it wasn't, they held until someone else could step in. They did not scream. They did not panic. They endured. The tide broke against them like a wave against stone, not because the humans were stronger, but because they refused to give ground the way everyone else always had. They exploited confusion when enemy coordination faltered, struck command nodes with surgical precision, and retreated only when it created advantage, not safety. After 3 days, the tide withdrew. It had never withdrawn before. Word spread. Quietly at first, then with growing urgency. Reports were verified, re-verified, scrutinized for error. The data held. A force that should have been erased had not only survived but inflicted disproportionate losses. More humans were requested. This time they were sent closer to the front. The pattern repeated. Where humans fought, the tide slowed. Where humans held, worlds remained in coalition hands. Casualties were high. Humans did not pretend otherwise, but morale did not collapse. They mourned briefly, then reorganized and continued. They did not fight as though they expected to live forever. They fought as though the fight itself mattered more than the outcome. In time, strategies changed. Coalition commanders began to plan around human endurance rather than alien fragility. Retreat doctrines were rewritten. Defensive lines became elastic, absorbing impact instead of shattering. For the first time since the war began, the tide encountered resistance that adapted faster than it did. The final campaign was brutal. The tide's core worlds were nests of bio-industrial horror, landscapes shaped entirely for war. Human forces spearheaded the assault not because they were expendable, but because they understood something fundamental. Fear could be used as a weapon. They advanced relentlessly, not recklessly but persistently. Every setback was analyzed, every failure incorporated into the next attempt. The tide, for all its size and coordination, had never faced an enemy that learned this way. When the central nexus fell, it did so not with a grand explosion, but with silence. The tide's collective intelligence fractured. Units stopped responding. Attacks became disorganized, then ceased entirely. The war ended not with celebration, but with exhaustion. In the aftermath, as the galaxy took stock of what remained, humanity declined offers of dominion, of elevated status, of empire. They asked instead for shared defense pacts, open exchange, and mutual support. "We don't need to rule," one human representative said. "We just don't want anyone fighting alone." Monuments were raised on worlds that still bore the scars of invasion. Names were carved into stone and alloy, human and alien together. Stories were told, not of invincible warriors, but of stubborn ones. Of a species that evolved on a world that tried to kill it every day and learned, through sheer necessity, how to keep going anyway. The myths were updated, not as legends of monsters, but as warnings. If the galaxy ever forgot the value of endurance, if it ever mistook comfort for strength again, it would only need to remember one simple truth. Humanity was not special because it was powerful. Humanity was terrifying because it refused to stop. The end of the war did not feel like an ending. That was the first thing the galaxy struggled to understand. For generations, victory had always been imagined as a moment, an explosion, a surrender, a ceremonial declaration transmitted across every remaining network. Something clean and definitive. Instead, the devourer tide simply unraveled. Entire formations drifted inert in space. Ground forces stood motionless where they had last received instructions, biological machinery still humming, minds suddenly empty. Worlds that had braced for annihilation found themselves staring at silent enemies they no longer knew how to fight. Coalition commanders hesitated for weeks, fearing deception. Humans did not. Human units moved methodically through former battle zones, securing, disarming, documenting. They treated the end of the war the same way they had treated the war itself, not as an emotional milestone, but as a task requiring discipline. They cleared corridors one by one. They checked every body. They guarded against the possibility that something might wake back up. Only after certainty replaced caution did the weight truly settle in. Entire species emerged from shelters they had lived in for decades. Children saw open skies for the first time. Elders, who had spent their entire adult lives planning for extinction, found themselves alive with no enemy left to hate. The galaxy did not erupt into celebration so much as collapse into grief, relief, and disbelief all at once. Humanity stayed. That, too, confused everyone. They did not immediately return to Earth. They did not consolidate power. They did not leverage their reputation to demand territory or tribute. Instead, human engineers helped restore power grids on ruined worlds. Human medics trained alien caregivers in trauma response techniques refined through centuries of human conflict and disaster. Human logisticians helped rebuild supply chains so efficient that starvation disappeared from multiple sectors within a single cycle. When asked why, their answers were always unsatisfying in the same way. Because it needs doing. Some alien leaders found this unsettling. They were used to motives with sharp edges: profit, survival, dominance. Humanity operated on something harder to define: obligation without expectation. It made them difficult to predict and impossible to manipulate. On Earth, the war was taught carefully, not as triumph, as cost. Children learned the names of worlds they had never seen and people they would never meet. They learned that humanity had not gone to the stars to save the galaxy out of destiny or righteousness, but because someone had asked for help and humanity had been able to answer. That distinction mattered. Veterans returned home changed in ways that language struggled to capture. Earth itself felt smaller to them now, not because it was insignificant, but because it was no longer alone. Some stayed in coalition space permanently, building families across species lines, becoming bridges rather than soldiers. Others returned to quiet lives, carrying memories they rarely spoke about. The galaxy adjusted around them. Military academies rewrote doctrine. Endurance training became standard across species that had once believed prolonged stress to be pathological rather than survivable. Psychological resilience, once dismissed as a human quirk, became a field of study. The phrase "acceptable losses" was quietly removed from strategic lexicons, replaced with human-influenced models that emphasized sustainability over efficiency. Not everyone approved. There were whispers, of course. Fear rarely vanished. It only changed shape. Some wondered what would happen if humanity ever turned that refusal to quit against the coalition itself. Others worried that relying on humans had weakened the galaxy's own resolve. Humans heard these concerns. They did not argue. They demonstrated. When pirate enclaves attempted to fill the power vacuum left by the tide, human patrols did not annihilate them. They dismantled infrastructure, cut supply routes, and left warnings. When extremist factions tried to weaponize fragments of Tide biotechnology, human research teams neutralized the threat and published the findings openly, ensuring no single power could exploit the knowledge. Transparency, it turned out, was another human weapon. Years passed. The war became history, then myth, then lesson. Statues were erected on worlds humanity had saved, but humans themselves rarely stood before them for long. They found it uncomfortable being frozen in heroic poses that erased the exhaustion, the doubt, the pain. The monuments mattered more to those who needed reminders that survival had been possible. On the original outpost, the forgotten backwater where humanity had first been sent to fail, a single plaque was installed. No grand sculpture, just words etched into alloy salvaged from battle debris. We held because leaving meant someone else would die. No names, no ranks, just the truth. The galaxy learned slowly that HFY was not about domination or exceptionalism. It was not a declaration of superiority. It was a warning written into history by a species shaped under relentless pressure. Humanity had not survived because it was strongest. It had survived because it adapted, endured, and refused to abandon each other even when every rational calculation said it should. And now the galaxy knew. If darkness ever rose again, if some new horror crawled out of the void thinking the universe was fragile, it would not be met by a galaxy waiting to be consumed. It would be met by a galaxy that had learned at last how to keep going. Because somewhere among the stars there would always be humans, still breathing, still standing, still refusing to quit. The historians would argue later about when the true turning point occurred. Some would say it was the first time a human unit refused evacuation orders and held a line that should have collapsed in minutes. Others would claim it was the night raid that shattered the tide's coordination nexus, or the final push into the heart of the hive that broke the war forever. But among those who had lived through it, those who had watched worlds die and then watched humanity stand where logic said nothing should, there was a quieter answer. The turning point was when the galaxy realized that humans did not see survival the same way everyone else did. For most species, survival was an outcome, a goal to be achieved, a condition to be maintained. It was something that could be weighed against losses and traded away when the cost grew too high. For humans, survival was an action, something you did moment by moment regardless of the odds. You survived by continuing. You continued by refusing to stop. This difference reshaped everything. In the cycles following the war, joint coalition councils met more frequently than ever before. Once, these gatherings had been rigid affairs, dominated by hierarchy, protocol, and species-specific priorities. Now, human delegates sat among them, not as conquerors, not as saviors, but as participants who asked inconvenient questions. What happens to the people who don't make it into your recovery projections? What do you do when morale collapses, not because of defeat but because of exhaustion? Who takes responsibility when a plan works on paper but fails in reality? At first, these questions were unwelcome. They forced leaders to confront assumptions that had gone unchallenged for millennia. But over time, something remarkable happened. The answers improved. Coalition governance became messier, slower, and far more resilient. Human advisors encouraged redundancy where efficiency had once ruled. They argued for systems that could fail without collapsing entirely. They insisted that every plan include contingencies not just for success or failure, but for prolonged strain. Because, as one human strategist put it, the worst part isn't losing, it's losing slowly. On worlds still scarred by the tide, human reconstruction teams worked alongside locals, not as overseers but as laborers. They lifted debris, rewired power conduits, replanted soil rendered sterile by bioweapons. They taught techniques for reclaiming land humans themselves had learned after wars, disasters, and environmental collapse on Earth. Many aliens found it baffling that humans carried so much knowledge of recovery. "You speak as if this is not your first time rebuilding," one elder remarked. "It isn't," the human replied. Children born after the war grew up hearing stories not just of terror, but of endurance. In coalition schools, the concept of human time entered common language, a recognition that humans measured effort not in days or cycles, but in willingness. If a human said they could hold for 10 minutes, it meant 10 minutes under fire. If they said they could hold for a week, it meant a week without sleep if necessary. This reputation was not romanticized among humans themselves. Veterans knew the cost. They knew the nightmares that followed, the injuries that never fully healed, the quiet moments when the adrenaline faded and grief took its place. Humanity did not emerge unscarred. It emerged changed, carrying the weight of an entire galaxy's gratitude alongside its own losses. And yet, when asked if they would do it again, the answer was always the same. Yes. Not because they wanted to, not because they believed themselves destined, but because to humans the alternative, to turn away while others fell, was simply not acceptable. There came a day years later when an exploratory fleet detected something strange beyond the rim. Not an invasion, not a threat, just a signal, old, fragmented, and faint. Evidence of a civilization long thought extinct, reaching out into the dark with no idea who might answer. The coalition debated for months. Risk assessments were drafted, potential dangers cataloged. Some argued the galaxy had earned its peace and should not invite uncertainty back into its borders. Humanity listened. Then a single human vessel detached from its formation and altered course. It transmitted a simple message to the council as it went. "We'll take first contact. If it's dangerous, we'll hold it. If it's peaceful, we'll help. Either way, no one else has to stand alone." No one tried to stop them. That was the final lesson the galaxy learned about humans, not that they were fearless, Not that they were invincible, but that once humanity decided someone mattered, distance, danger, and despair stopped being obstacles and became merely terrain. The universe was vast, cold, indifferent, but it was no longer quiet, because somewhere out there, a species born on a violent little world with too much gravity and not enough mercy had decided that survival was better when it was shared, and that decision had changed everything. Time continued as it always did, indifferent to meaning. Stars burned, trade routes reopened. Civilizations that had braced for extinction began arguing again over resources, borders, ideology. Proof, some said, that the galaxy was finally healing. Humans observed this with a mix of familiarity and resignation. They had seen the pattern before on Earth. Peace did not erase conflict, it merely changed its scale. What mattered was that this time, conflict no longer meant annihilation by default. Human presence became a constant background pressure in galactic affairs, not dominance pressure. The quiet awareness that somewhere nearby, there existed a species that would notice if things went too far. A species that did not require permission to intervene when lines were crossed, but also did not rush to violence as a first solution. It was an uncomfortable balance. Some worlds resented it. They accused humans of moral arrogance, of imposing their values under the guise of cooperation. Human diplomats listened, acknowledged the criticism, and then asked a single question. Would you prefer we leave? Almost no one ever said yes, because beneath the resentment was memory. Memory of the tide, memory of standing on the brink and realizing too late that every safety margin had already been spent. Humanity represented something deeply unsettling to a galaxy built on optimization and restraint, proof that survival sometimes required excess of effort, of care, of stubborn refusal to let go. There were attempts to replicate humanity. Species with shorter lifespans tried to engineer endurance through genetic modification. Species with rigid social structures attempted to formalize human style, adaptability through doctrine. Artificial intelligences were trained on human battle records, human crisis response logs, human disaster recovery frameworks. None of it worked the way they hoped, because HFY had never been about methods. It was about mindset. Humans did not endure because they were trained to. They endured because, over millions of years, failure to do so meant extinction. The galaxy had learned endurance as a skill. Humans had learned it as a prerequisite for existence. This difference revealed itself most clearly during the first post-war crisis. It began small. A mining accident on a fringe world, structural collapse, radiation leaks, hundreds trapped underground. Local authorities declared the site lost within hours. Rescue projections showed survival probability dropping below acceptable thresholds. The standard response was evacuation and compensation. Human responders were already en route before the declaration was finalized. They arrived with equipment scavenged from half a dozen species, modified mid-flight. They ignored the projected survival curves and focused instead on what could be done in the next 10 minutes, then the next 10 after that. They dug, stabilized, reinforced, rotated crews to prevent collapse. They pulled survivors out after 12 days. 12 days beyond the point where the models said no one could still be alive. The galaxy watched, stunned, as humans emerged from the tunnels carrying exhausted, injured miners who should have been dead by every established metric. When asked why they had continued long after the data said it was pointless, a human engineer answered simply. The data didn't say impossible, it said unlikely. From that moment on, unlikely ceased to be an acceptable stopping point. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the galaxy began to shift its definition of responsibility. Not just what could be done efficiently, but what could be attempted ethically. Not just how many could be saved, but whether leaving others behind was truly justified. This did not make life easier. It made it harder, but it made it matter. Humanity never claimed credit for these changes. In fact, many humans were uncomfortable with the growing reverence surrounding their species. They resisted titles, rejected myths forming around them, corrected exaggerated stories whenever they heard them. "We bleed," they would say. "We break. We get scared." What they did not say, what they did not need to, was that fear, pain, and doubt had never stopped them before. On Earth, the stars looked the same as they always had. Children still grew up under familiar skies, learning history that now stretched beyond their planet into a wider universe. They learned about the war not as a moment of glory, but as a reminder of what happens when preparation gives way to complacency. They learned that humanity's greatest strength was not its technology or numbers, but its refusal to accept that suffering elsewhere was someone else's problem. Old veterans gathered sometimes, in quiet places far from ceremony. They did not talk much about battles. They talked about people, those they fought beside, those they lost, those they saved. They talked about how strange it felt to be remembered as something larger than they ever felt at the time. Most of them would have preferred to be forgotten. Because to humans, heroism was not an identity. It was a momentary role assumed under pressure, then set aside so life could continue. As decades turned into centuries, the galaxy stopped asking what humans were capable of in war. The more important question became what the galaxy itself was capable of now that it knew quitting was optional. And in that question, uncomfortable, demanding, impossible to ignore, the true legacy of humanity endured, not as conquerors, not as saviors, but as proof that survival was not a matter of perfection, strength, or destiny. It was a matter of choice, and humans again and again had chosen to keep going. There came a point when the galaxy stopped measuring time from the end of the war and began measuring it from the moment humans arrived. Not officially. No calendar was rewritten. No decree was issued. It happened the way all real changes happen, quietly through habit. Through phrases like "before the humans" and "after humanity learned our names." Through doctrines labeled legacy and others marked post-contact. Through the slow realization that the galaxy had crossed a threshold it could never uncross. The most unsettling thing was that humans never acted like they knew this. They continued to argue among themselves. They disagreed publicly, sometimes loudly, about policy, intervention, and responsibility. They held elections. They protested their own governments. They debated whether they should still be out there among the stars, carrying burdens that were not theirs by origin. To the rest of the galaxy, this was bewildering. To humans, it was normal. Internal conflict did not weaken them. It sharpened them. It forced constant reevaluation, constant adaptation. Where other species feared dissent as fracture, humans treated it as pressure testing. Bad ideas were argued into collapse. Good ones survived because they could withstand scrutiny. Coalition analysts eventually understood something crucial. Humanity did not rely on consensus to act. It relied on commitment. Once humans committed to a mission, a people, a promise, they would argue endlessly about how to fulfill it, but almost never about whether to abandon it. That decision, once made, was treated as final. This became apparent during the first major schism after the war. A peripheral alliance world declared independence from the coalition, citing decades of neglect and exploitation that predated the tide. The situation escalated quickly. Fleets mobilized, trade routes were threatened. Some called for force to maintain unity at any cost, fearing that fragmentation would invite future catastrophe. Humans were asked to intervene. They refused. Instead, they sent mediators, engineers, economists, historians, people who had studied not just war but collapse. They listened to grievances, to anger, to fear. They acknowledged fault where it existed and did not defend systems simply because they were old. It took years, but the conflict de-escalated, not because humans imposed peace, but because they modeled something the galaxy had rarely seen: accountability without annihilation, strength without coercion, persistence without domination. That world rejoined the coalition later, not out of fear, but because separation no longer felt like the only way to be heard. This, too, became part of the human reputation. Not warriors, not diplomats, stabilizers. Of course, there were limits. When slavers attempted to exploit post-war chaos in the outer regions, human response was immediate and absolute. There were no negotiations, no gradual pressure. Human strike groups dismantled the networks with surgical precision, leaving behind incontrovertible evidence and a clear message. Some lines, once crossed, ended discussion. The galaxy learned to recognize those lines, not because humans published them, but because they enforced them consistently. Protect civilians, honor surrender, do not build prosperity on suffering. These were not uniquely human values, but humanity treated them as non-negotiable. Fear followed, inevitably. Not fear of invasion, but fear of judgment. Some leaders resented this deeply. They accused humans of hypocrisy, pointing to humanity's own violent past. Humans did not deny it. Yes, they said, we did terrible things, that's why we don't excuse them now. This answer satisfied no one completely, and that was the point. On Earth, the sky remained unchanged, but humanity itself began to evolve in subtle ways. Exposure to alien cultures, psychologies, and philosophies expanded what it meant to be human without diluting its core. New art forms emerged, blending perspectives across species. New sciences developed, informed by alien biology and human stubborn creativity. Children grew up fluent in multiple languages, some spoken, some gestural, some electromagnetic. They learned early that intelligence did not always wear a familiar shape, and that fragility was often an illusion. Yet even as humanity changed, one thing remained constant. When crises came, natural disasters, system failures, political breakdowns, humans showed up. Sometimes they were invited, sometimes they were not. But they came anyway, with supplies, expertise, and the same quiet assumption that effort mattered even when success was uncertain. This behavior reshaped interstellar ethics more profoundly than any treaty. The idea that responsibility extended beyond borders, beyond species, beyond self-interest became harder to dismiss when one species demonstrated it over and over again without demanding reward. Centuries later, when the first true intergalactic probe returned with evidence of intelligence beyond the coalition's known space, the debate was intense. Some argued for isolation, others for caution. A few advocated preemptive defense. Humanity's position was characteristically frustrating. "We'll go look," they said, carefully. When asked what they would do if the unknown intelligence proved hostile, the answer was simple: "Then we'll deal with it." "And if it's stronger than you?" someone asked. Humans paused at that. Then one of them smiled, not with confidence, but with something quieter. "Then we'll hold as long as we can, and we'll make sure you have time." That was the moment the galaxy finally understood. Humanity was not dangerous because it was powerful. Humanity was dangerous because it had internalized sacrifice to the point where it no longer required justification. They did not see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as the line, not because they wanted to be, but because every time the universe asked who would stand when standing was irrational, humanity had answered without hesitation. And so the stars remained lit, not because darkness had been defeated forever, but because someone somewhere would always choose to face it head-on and refuse to step aside. In the end, what unsettled the galaxy most was not what humans did in moments of crisis, but what they did when there was nothing urgent demanding their attention. They did not relax into complacency. Peace did not make them idle. Instead, humanity treated peace the way it treated survival itself, as something that required maintenance. Human research institutions began collaborating across species lines, not to create stronger weapons, but to understand failure. They studied collapsed civilizations, not as historical curiosities, but as case studies. Why had they failed? At what point had warning signs been ignored? Which decisions had felt reasonable at the time but proved catastrophic in hindsight? This focus disturbed many coalition scholars. Traditionally, the past was examined either to glorify success or to assign blame. Humans did neither. They treated history like a diagnostic tool, disassembling it piece by piece to understand how systems broke under stress. You speak as though collapse is inevitable, one alien academic observed. Humans shrugged. Everything breaks eventually, they replied. The trick is making sure it doesn't take everyone with it. From this philosophy emerged a quiet revolution in infrastructure and governance. Redundancy was no longer considered wasteful. Emergency stockpiles were expanded far beyond minimum projections. Communication networks were designed to degrade gracefully rather than fail catastrophically. Even cultural practices shifted, with more emphasis placed on collective responsibility rather than hierarchical obedience. The galaxy became slower, less efficient, and far harder to kill. This was not without cost. Growth rates dipped, trade profits narrowed. Some worlds complained that human influence was stifling ambition and innovation. Humans listened, acknowledged the concern, and then pointed to the star maps of a century earlier, maps stained red with extinction. Ambition without resilience, they said, just gives disaster something to aim for. There were those who never accepted this lesson. On a distant frontier, a coalition of species rejected post-war reforms entirely. They dismantled safety nets, centralized power, and pursued rapid expansion through aggressive exploitation of newly reclaimed worlds. For a time, it worked. Their economies surged. Their fleets grew sleek and formidable. They mocked what they called human pessimism. Then their core star destabilized. It was a rare astrophysical event, unpredictable and violent. Within days, entire systems faced evacuation or annihilation. The coalition's centralized infrastructure collapsed under the strain. Emergency channels overloaded. Decision-making bottlenecked at the top. They called for help. Humans responded instantly, not with judgment, not with lectures, with ships. Human evacuation fleets arrived ahead of projections, rerouting resources without waiting for formal authorization. They decentralized command on the fly, empowering local leaders instead of waiting for central approval. They stayed long after the immediate danger passed, helping rebuild systems that could survive future shocks. Millions lived who would otherwise have died. Afterward, one of the coalition's leaders asked the human commander why they had come so quickly, despite years of ideological hostility. The human answered without hesitation, because people were going to die. There was no follow-up, no demand for apology, no expectation of gratitude. That was when the galaxy finally understood that humanity's defining trait was not stubbornness or endurance or even courage. It was consistency. Humans did not pick and choose when their values applied. They did not recalibrate their ethics based on convenience or alliance. Once they decided that certain lines mattered, life, dignity, shared survival, they enforced those lines relentlessly, including against themselves. This consistency made them terrifying adversaries and invaluable allies. As centuries passed, humans became woven into the fabric of galactic civilization so thoroughly that imagining a galaxy without them felt incomplete. Not because they dominated culture or politics, but because they filled gaps no one else could or would. They volunteered for missions with low survival probabilities. They staffed disaster response teams permanently. They designed protocols for worst-case scenarios that others preferred not to contemplate. They remembered. That perhaps was their greatest contribution. They remembered what it felt like to be alone on a hostile world, surrounded by forces that did not care whether they lived or died. They remembered what it cost to survive without help, and they carried that memory into every decision, every intervention, every refusal to walk away. Near the edge of known space, on a station built from salvaged hulls and human ingenuity, there was a small inscription carved into a support beam. It was not officially sanctioned. No one knew who had written it. It simply read, "We made it because someone didn't quit on us, so we won't quit on you." Travelers paused there sometimes, reading the words in silence. Some found them comforting. Others found them unsettling. Both reactions were correct, because the galaxy now lived with a quiet certainty that if the universe ever decided to test existence again, if some new darkness rose, confident that time, numbers, or inevitability would win, there would be humans standing in the way, not shouting, not posturing, just planting their feet and saying, with the calm certainty of a species that had learned this lesson the hard way, "No, not today." And if that was not enough, if the darkness was too vast, too old, too powerful to be stopped entirely, then humanity would do what it had always done: hold long enough, bleed long enough, endure long enough, so that someone else could survive. And in that refusal to let the universe take everything, the legacy of humanity would continue, not as legend, not as myth, but as a simple, relentless fact. Humanity was still here, and that meant hope was too. The galaxy did not realize it was being tested again until the test was already underway. It did not arrive as an invasion fleet or a roaring tide of destruction. There were no burning systems, no emergency broadcasts, no immediate body count to trigger alarm. That was what made it dangerous. That was what made it familiar to humans in a way that unsettled everyone else. It began with silence. Long-range observation arrays along the far rim started reporting anomalies, communications delays that could not be explained by distance alone, sensor ghosts that vanished when directly observed, ships that failed to arrive at destinations despite flawless navigation logs. At first, analysts blamed equipment degradation, then software drift, then operator error. Each explanation fit neatly into existing assumptions. Humans were the first to object. "This looks like the early phase of a systems failure cascade," a human analyst said during a routine review. "Not mechanical, behavioral." Coalition officials dismissed the concern politely. There was no visible enemy, no identifiable threat vector, no reason to escalate. Humans logged the objection anyway. They always did. Weeks later, frontier stations began reporting personnel changes that made no sense. Crews who had served together for decades suddenly stopped communicating. Command hierarchies froze, not due to rebellion but indecision. Requests for guidance went unanswered, not because leadership was absent, but because leadership could not agree on what action to take. Morale did not collapse, it evaporated. Humans watching the data exchange recognized the pattern instantly. Burnout, not physical, cognitive, a pressure that built slowly, invisibly, until decision-making itself became painful. The galaxy had spent centuries rebuilding, stabilizing, maintaining peace through constant vigilance. Now that vigilance had become exhausting. Every contingency plan, every safeguard, every redundancy demanded attention, and attention was finite. Something, no one yet knew what, was exploiting that. Humans did not wait for confirmation. They deployed support teams, not military units, counselors, systems analysts, organizational specialists, humans who had studied institutional fatigue the way others studied weapons. They embedded themselves in affected stations and worlds, not to command but to observe. What they found was unsettling. There was no sabotage, no infection, no external manipulation that sensors could detect. The problem was internal. The galaxy had learned how to endure crises, but it had not learned how to rest without collapsing. Humans had, because Earth had nearly destroyed itself more than once, not through sudden catastrophe, but through slow erosion of trust, empathy, and shared purpose. Humans had developed, painfully, the cultural tools to recognize when systems were failing, not because of external pressure, but because they demanded more than people could give indefinitely. "You're burning out entire civilizations," a human coordinator said during a closed council session. Not with violence, with expectation. The accusation was met with outrage, and then with silence, because it was true. The post-war galaxy had tried to be perfect, prepared for everything, ready at all times. In doing so, it had created a state of permanent emergency without an enemy to justify it. Species that evolved for cycles of activity and recovery had been locked into constant readiness. Humans proposed something radical. They proposed standing down, not disarmament, not vulnerability, but intentional rest, rotational disengagement. Systems designed not just to survive stress but to recover from it, cultural permission to pause without guilt. Many leaders resisted. "What if something happens while we're resting?" Humans answered calmly. "Then we respond, rested." It took a crisis to force the issue. A major trade nexus froze entirely. No violence, no failure, just paralysis. Automated systems waited for confirmation from organic authorities who could not agree on who should decide. Millions were stranded. Supplies dwindled. Panic began to spread. Human teams intervened. They bypassed frozen hierarchies, empowered local operators, simplified decision chains, and, most controversially, ordered mandatory rest cycles for command staff. Some leaders protested. Some threatened sanctions. Humans ignored them. The nexus recovered in days. Afterward, data showed something remarkable. Productivity increased. Error rates dropped. Communication clarity improved, not because systems were stronger, but because the people inside them were no longer exhausted. The galaxy learned another uncomfortable lesson. Endurance without recovery was just another way to die slowly. Humans began to be consulted not just in emergencies, but in planning for peace. They helped design cultural frameworks that normalized stepping back before collapse occurred. They taught other species something humans themselves had learned too late, too often. You cannot fight forever, but you can prepare to fight again. As this understanding spread, the earlier anomalies faded. Whatever had exploited the galaxy's exhaustion found no purchase once systems regained balance. No enemy was ever identified, no victory declared. Humans were satisfied anyway, because for them success was not measured by defeating an opponent. It was measured by preventing the need to. And once again, without fanfare or recognition, humanity had done what it always did. Not saved the galaxy in a single dramatic moment, but kept it from quietly breaking when no one else noticed it was close. They remained vigilant, but no longer frantic. They stood ready, but allowed themselves and others to breathe. And in that balance, fragile and imperfect, the galaxy found something it had never truly known before. Not safety, but sustainability. And as always, humans stayed, watching, waiting, prepared to endure again if the universe ever demanded it. The realization that followed was not comforting. It was heavier than fear. The galaxy had spent so long bracing for destruction that it had never considered the possibility that survival itself could become a threat if handled poorly. Humanity forced that realization into the open, not by warning speeches or grand declarations, but by doing what they always did, stepping in where systems were failing and refusing to let inertia finish the job. From that moment on, humans were no longer just defenders against external threats. They became guardians against internal collapse. This role was not welcomed by everyone. Some accused humanity of overreach, of inserting itself into matters that should remain sovereign. Others whispered that humans were slowly reshaping the galaxy in their own image, not through conquest, but through cultural gravity. Humans listened to these criticisms carefully, debated them internally, and then continued anyway, because the alternative was worse. They had seen what happened when societies ignored slow failure. Earth's history was filled with examples: empires that rotted from the inside, institutions that persisted long after they stopped serving the people within them, systems that collapsed not from attack, but from neglect. Humanity carried those scars forward like a map of places never to return to, and so they stayed involved. They created early warning networks not for invasion, but for stagnation. Metrics that tracked not just economic output or military readiness, but trust, communication, and social strain. These systems did not issue alarms, they issued questions. Why are decisions slowing here? Why are people disengaging there? Why is this system still functioning but barely? At first, other species resisted the intrusion. These were uncomfortable questions. They demanded introspection instead of action, humility instead of authority. But over time, results spoke louder than pride. Civil wars were prevented before they began. Economic collapses were softened into controlled contractions. Cultural fractures that might once have led to violence were addressed through dialogue while dialogue was still possible. None of this was clean. Humans did not pretend otherwise. They made mistakes, sometimes serious ones. They misread cultural signals, underestimated historical wounds, assumed compatibility where there was none. When that happened, they did something else the galaxy was not used to seeing. They admitted it publicly. They adjusted. They apologized. They withdrew when necessary. This, too, was unsettling. Power that corrected itself was harder to fight than power that pretended perfection. As generations passed, the term HFY began to lose its edge. It was no longer shouted in stories of last stands or whispered in awe during battles. It became something quieter, almost mundane, a shorthand. HFY meant that when everything else failed, someone would still show up. Not because they were ordered to, not because it was profitable, but because walking away had never been an option humanity could live with. Children across the galaxy learned this not as doctrine but as expectation. They grew up assuming that aid would come, that persistence was possible, that extinction was not the default ending of history. This assumption reshaped ambition itself. Species that once planned cautiously, fearing that overreach would invite annihilation, began to imagine futures that extended further than a few safe generations. The universe did not become kinder. It remained vast, violent, and indifferent. Stars still exploded without warning. Diseases still emerged. Accidents still happened. Conflict still flared. But the response to these events was no longer resignation. It was engagement. And at the center of that engagement, humanity remained, not as leaders issuing commands, but as participants sharing burden. Old human veterans died eventually, as all living things do. Their names faded from public memory, preserved only in archives and in the quiet traditions they helped build. New humans took their place, born into a galaxy that no longer questioned whether humans belonged among the stars. They belonged because they stayed. One human historian near the end of her life was asked to summarize humanity's impact on the galaxy. She considered the question for a long time before answering. "We didn't save anyone," she said. "We just refused to accept that things had to end badly." That answer circulated widely. Some found it underwhelming. Others found it profound. Both were correct, because HFY was never about spectacle. It was about persistence. About showing up on the worst days and the quiet days after. About understanding that survival was not a single act of defiance, but 1,000 small decisions to continue when stopping would be easier. And if the universe ever tried again, if it sent something worse than the tide, something clever than exhaustion, something that believed inevitability was on its side, it would find the same thing waiting for it. Not gods, not legends, just humans, still flawed, still arguing, still tired. Still here, and that, the galaxy had learned, was more than enough. The first time a human finally said no, the galaxy panicked. It was a small crisis by any historical measure. A border dispute between two mid-tier systems escalating toward open conflict. The usual signals were there: mobilization orders, nationalist rhetoric, accusations traded through official channels. In the past, humans would have intervened quickly, inserting mediators, relief units, or peacekeeping forces before violence could spiral. This time they did not. Coalition leaders reached out, expecting the familiar calm responses, the measured plans, the quiet assurance that someone was already on the way. Instead, they received something unprecedented. A refusal, not absolute, not cold, but firm. "We will not intervene directly," the human envoy said. "Not yet." The reaction was immediate and severe. Accusations of abandonment flew. Old fears resurfaced. Had humanity grown tired? Had it decided the galaxy was no longer worth the effort? Some even whispered that humans were withdrawing to consolidate power, preparing for a future where they stood alone. Humans listened to every word. Then they explained. "You're not facing extinction," the envoy said. "You're facing disagreement. If we step in now, we teach you that conflict only resolves when someone else carries the weight. You've learned how to survive disasters. You still need to learn how to resolve friction without expecting rescue." This explanation satisfied no one. And yet humans did not waver. They stayed nearby. They monitored. They prepared contingencies. They positioned evacuation ships just beyond sensor range. But they did not intervene. The conflict unfolded slowly, awkwardly. Negotiations collapsed, resumed, collapsed again. There were protests, economic pressure, limited skirmishes that frightened both sides more than they harmed them. Every escalation was met with immediate fear of crossing a line that humans might no longer forgive. That fear worked. Eventually, the two systems reached an agreement, not a perfect one, not even a particularly elegant one, but it held. And when it did, something subtle but profound happened. The galaxy realized that humanity's presence had never been about control. It had been about capacity. Humans had carried the load while the galaxy learned how heavy it could be. Now, slowly and deliberately, they were setting some of that weight down, not to abandon it but to share it properly. This marked the beginning of a new phase. Humans shifted from constant responders to strategic anchors. They trained others to recognize crises early, to intervene decisively, to endure pressure without collapsing. They stepped back where stepping back strengthened local resolve and stepped forward only when lines were truly at risk. Some humans struggled with this transition. They were used to showing up, used to being needed. Letting others fail, safely, constructively, felt wrong. It took time for humanity itself to accept that restraint could also be an act of care. But they learned, because humans always did. Decades passed without galaxy-ending threats. This absence felt unnatural to those who remembered the tide, who remembered exhaustion masquerading as vigilance. Humans resisted the urge to manufacture purpose where none was required. Instead, they built quietly. They helped design educational systems that taught critical thinking rather than obedience. They supported cultural exchanges that emphasized empathy without erasing difference. They invested in technologies that reduced scarcity rather than accelerated growth. None of it was glamorous. All of it mattered. Eventually, children born long after the war began asking questions that startled their elders. Was it really that bad? Did the galaxy really almost end? Why didn't anyone stop it sooner? Humans answered honestly. Yes, yes, because we didn't know how. That honesty became a cornerstone of the new galactic identity, not the denial of past failure but the acknowledgement of it. Not the promise that it would never happen again, but the commitment to notice sooner next time. And there would be a next time. Everyone knew that. The universe did not change its nature simply because one species refused to quit. Entropy remained undefeated. Chaos still found cracks. The unknown still waited beyond the edges of perception. But the galaxy was no longer naive. It had seen what persistence looked like. It had felt what shared endurance could accomplish. It had learned that survival was not a finite resource to be hoarded, but a process to be practiced together. And humanity, having never claimed ownership of that lesson, remained its most consistent reminder. They were still there when storms passed, still there when systems faltered, still there when hope thinned and someone needed proof that continuing was possible, not because they were perfect, but because quitting had never been part of who they were. And as long as that remained true, the galaxy would never again face the darkness alone. Eventually, the galaxy stopped asking whether humanity would always be there. It started asking a harder question. What would it mean if one day they were? The question emerged quietly, in academic circles first, then in policy forums, then in late-cycle conversations between leaders who remembered the war not as history, but as lived memory. Humanity had become a constant, not immutable but reliable in a way no other force had ever been. Entire contingency frameworks implicitly assumed that if a situation became dire enough, humans would step in. Humans noticed this assumption forming. It unsettled them, because humans understood something the galaxy still struggled with. Endurance was not infinite. It could be renewed, yes, rebuilt, shared, but only if responsibility was truly distributed. If humanity became the galaxy's final safety net forever, then eventually that net would tear. So humanity did something profoundly uncomfortable. They began preparing the galaxy for a future where humans were not the answer. They framed it carefully, knowing how easily it could be misunderstood. They did not announce withdrawal or diminish cooperation. Instead, They focused on redundancy of values rather than assets. They invested in leadership development among species that had historically deferred to human judgment. They encouraged regional alliances to resolve crises without escalating to coalition or human involvement. They stopped rushing to be first, and when they did intervene, they made a point of working through others, not around them. At first, this created friction. Some accused humans of becoming distant, of withholding support. Humans countered with a question they had asked many times before. You do this without us. When the answer was yes, they stepped back. When the answer was no, they stayed and taught until it became yes. This shift reached its most difficult test when a phenomenon later known as the veil collapse occurred. It was not an enemy. It was a region of space where physical constants destabilized unpredictably. Ships vanished. Signals distorted. Navigation became impossible. Entire trade corridors collapsed overnight. No hostile intent. No intelligence to negotiate with. Just reality failing. The coalition panicked. This was exactly the kind of thing humanity had always handled: complex, ambiguous, deadly, and slow, cascading ways. The expectation was immediate and unspoken. Humans would take charge. Instead, humanity called an emergency assembly and did something unprecedented. They refused to lead. "We will participate," a human representative said. "We will advise, we will share resources, but we will not command this response." Outrage followed. Fear followed harder. "You're condemning us," one leader accused. "You're gambling with lives." The human reply was steady. "No, we're gambling with dependency, and that cost is higher in the long run." The response structure that emerged was chaotic, inefficient, and deeply uncomfortable. Species argued, authority overlapped. Decisions took longer than anyone liked. Mistakes were made. Humans stayed. They absorbed blame when things went wrong. They shielded less experienced coordinators from political backlash. They quietly corrected failures without taking credit. And slowly, painfully, the galaxy learned. It learned how to coordinate without a single stabilizing pillar. It learned how to persist through confusion. It learned how to act without certainty that someone else would fix it. The veil collapse was eventually contained. Not solved, contained. The region remained dangerous, unstable, and partially lost. But the response had prevented catastrophe on a scale that would once have been inevitable. The galaxy survived, on its own. That was the moment humanity finally allowed itself to rest. Not withdraw, not disengage, but trust. Trust that what they had modeled, endurance, responsibility, refusal to quit, had taken root deeply enough to outlast them. Human philosophers would later argue that this was humanity's true victory, not defeating the tide, not reshaping galactic ethics, but making themselves optional without making the galaxy fragile. To be needed was easy. To be unnecessary and still choose to care, that was harder. As centuries passed, humans changed again. Lifespans lengthened. Technology blurred the line between biology and machine. Some humans left Earth permanently, adapting to environments no ancestral human body could survive. Others remained fiercely traditional, anchoring themselves to the gravity well that had forged them. Through it all, one truth remained constant. When humans disappeared from a place, they left something behind. Not monuments, not weapons, not fear, but habits. Habits of checking twice. Habits of preparing for failure. Habits of asking who else will be affected if we stop. Long after the last human left a frontier station, those habits endured. And so, when future historians finally attempted to summarize humanity's role in the galaxy, long after the last veteran had died, long after Earth itself had changed beyond recognition, they struggled to find the right words. In the end, one phrase survived peer review, debate, and translation across hundreds of languages. Humanity did not save the galaxy. Humanity taught the galaxy how not to give up. And once that lesson existed, once it lived in countless minds and cultures, it could never truly be erased. Because the most dangerous idea humanity ever shared was also the simplest. That no matter how vast the darkness, no matter how inevitable defeat appears, stopping is always a choice. And humans had proven, again and again, that it was one they would never make lightly. Long after humanity had taught the galaxy how to endure without leaning on them, the universe offered one final, quiet test. It did not arrive with alarms. There were no emergency councils, no frantic calls for intervention. In fact, most species did not notice it at all at first. It was recorded as a statistical anomaly, an unexpected increase in failed long-range colonization efforts. Ships launched with optimism returned years later depleted, crews diminished, morale shattered. Some never returned at all, not destroyed, simply lost to apathy. Explorers stopped exploring. Pioneers stopped pushing outward. The edge of known space began to harden, not from danger but from reluctance. Human sociologists recognized the pattern immediately. Exploration fatigue. It was something humanity knew intimately. Entire eras of Earth's history had been defined not by catastrophe, but by exhaustion with progress itself. When the cost of reaching further began to outweigh the perceived reward, civilizations turned inward. Not violently, quietly, comfortably, and then they stagnated. The galaxy had learned how to survive disaster. It had not yet learned how to survive success. Humans debated what to do. This time there was no obvious crisis, no moral emergency that demanded immediate action. No one was dying in large numbers. No worlds were burning. If humans intervened here, it would not be to save lives but to preserve momentum. Was that their role? The debate lasted years. In the end, humanity chose not to intervene directly. Instead, they told stories, not propaganda, not inspiration campaigns, stories shared freely across cultures, translated imperfectly, allowed to mutate as they spread. Stories of early Earth explorers who crossed oceans without knowing what waited on the other side. Stories of failure, of ships lost, of expeditions that achieved nothing except the knowledge that something had been tried. Stories of people who went anyway. They did not frame exploration as destiny or conquest. They framed it as curiosity with consequences, as risk undertaken not because success was guaranteed, but because stagnation carried its own quiet cost. Some species ignored the stories. Others listened politely and changed nothing. A few felt something stir. New expeditions launched, not massive, well-funded endeavors, but small ones. Crews who accepted uncertainty as part of the bargain, who did not expect rescue but prepared for hardship anyway, who carried the galaxy's accumulated lessons about endurance into the unknown. Humans watched. They did not follow, because this time they did not need to. Decades later, when the first signals came back from beyond the old frontier, evidence of new worlds, new life, new challenges, the galaxy did not look to humanity for permission or leadership. It simply went. Humanity smiled at that, not with pride, with relief. They had done what they came to do. The universe remained dangerous. It always would. There would be new threats, new failures, new moments when stopping would seem reasonable. Humanity did not pretend otherwise. They simply trusted now that when those moments came, the question would no longer be who will save us. It would be who will stand up first. And somewhere, on some world, on some station, on some fragile vessel pushing into the dark, someone would. Because that habit had taken root. Because that refusal had been learned. Because long ago, a stubborn species from a hostile little world had shown the galaxy that endurance was not an anomaly. It was a choice. And choices, once learned, could be made by anyone. Humanity remained part of the galaxy, but it was no longer its crutch. It was its proof, and that was enough.